So in the last video, I talked a little bit about how you would paint a face as a whole, but I'm sure a lot of you were a little bit confused or a little bit struggling on how to render those individual features on their own. And so in this video, I thought I would take some time to go over some of the very interesting features that character designers or artists like me typically alter or change in order to change the face. And so let's start by talking about the eyes, which are the windows to the soul, and something that viewers will tend to gravitate towards as we tend to try to capture someone else's eye contact, correct? So let me go over the basic structure of an eye. A sphere. All right, this line is too big. Let me just bump that down to a size 10. Right, so we have ourselves the eyeball, and with it we have ourselves typically the iris, the pupil. The iris is the colored part, so this is where you would typically see pretty blue eyes. Have you seen those piercing blue eyes? This is the part that you're typically seeing. Your little pupil is where you catch the light. And so the eye is then covered up by your eyelids. So they're typically look like teardrops / almond shapes. And so it's gonna wrap around, cover up your eye, basically like this. And then you're gonna have top lashes are typically a little bit thicker than your bottom lashes. Right, so that's the basic structure of a front-facing eye. I'm just gonna fix that up because it looks a little wonky from here. From my perspective, looks a little too small. So your eyelashes will be here, your bottom lashes will be here. Then your eyelids are gonna cover it up just about like this. Right, and so that's from the front view. Now, it only helps if you consider the eyelid as a 3D shape when you're shading it. So usually the way I like to think about it, again, as a clamshell shape. So from the side view, got your iris, your pupil, and when I think about it, I think about the eyelid wrapping around that eyeball, right? So it's gonna wrap around like this. Almost creepy like, but then it gets covered up by your eyelashes so it doesn't look so creepy. And typically you got your brow bone here, and there's some fat under your bottom lid so it doesn't actually protrude out as much as you think it would. Right? It typically ends up being like this. And so that's how you would think about shaping your eye, the clamshell shape. Or if you think about how you paint or draw simplified Disney character eyelashes, they typically simplify it to just these two half cap shape kind of things. And so if you're able to think about eyes in that kind of term, and then eyelids will come very naturally to you when you're trying to shade them. And so let's try to shade an eye, right? Let me draw a typical eye, very simple, minimal lashes, sort of an almond shape, almond / teardrop shape. I like to do my eyes sloping upwards and then curving down a little bit, and then I start with the bottom lashes and close them out to give the illusion that there's a bottom lid. Draw in my iris and pupil, draw in your eyelids. Now, here's where you really get to have fun. If you choose to make your eyelid bigger, then you have more space for you to do interesting shading. Whereas if you made your eyelid really small, or if you make it a monolid, say like this, you have more depth, more darkness, and less of the space to do those fun kind of makeup things. And so let's do a middle ground today. Something like that, right? Your eyebrow is going to sit right here. Okay, let's try to shade this. And so this section right here is probably the deepest part of your eye. If you feel your eyeball right now, this is the part where you can actually feel your eye socket. You can feel your bone, correct? And so this is the part where you typically would apply the darkest shade of your overall eye. And so let's do that for here. Let's apply ourselves the darkest shade. Something you may want to consider is whether or not your eye is deep set. If it's deep set, it will have a darker shadow like this. Whereas if it's got a little more fat, like in hooded eyes or in monolids, then you're going to see it a lot lighter, right? So let me just apply a general shadow to the eye socket space because your eyes are sunken in, whereas only this upper brow part is going to catch some of that light. So we're going to apply a little bit of that darkness because today I'm deciding that I don't want such a dark eye, deep set eye. Maybe they're a little bit hooded. And you see how I'm switching between a flat brush and a soft brush to build up the eye and build up the skin values, because you want to make sure you have some crispness when it comes to rendering the face. Because if it's all soft shadows, say like this, let's show you, all soft shadows, then you kind of lose the structure without the line, right? But if you had some of those lines in there, you can see that it helps you build the structure of the face whenever you remove the line. And so we got to make sure we keep a good balance of sharp edges and softer edges. And today we're pretending that this person has a hooded eye. So this part's going to be sort of more darker. And this part's going to have this radio shading where it's going to be darker closer to that edge and lighter as it comes away from it. Right, check our navigator, see how the values are working. I think we can lighten up some of these areas, specifically right around here, where the wetness, moistness of the eyelid will catch some of that light from the light source. And the eyelashes are going to cast a shadow over the eye. And we're going to be, since we know that the eyeball is a sphere, we have to treat it like a sphere. So we got to make sure we keep our core shadows. So it's going to wrap around here. These two ends are going to be darker because the sphere is inside and it's recessed into the shadows, correct? So even if I'm stylizing the eye, I gotta make sure I keep that kind of value going on in order for it to read like an eye and it not to come out super flat. Now, as for the bottom lid, again, sometimes if the eye is protruding out more, you're gonna get to see more shading like this. In which the eyeball is going to pop out, sort of like that. Or in some situations where the eye is more deep set and it doesn't pop out as much, maybe you only get a slight crease where the eyeball does come out. Something like this. Maybe something like that. If it's not as protruding out, it would just only have a little bit of that. And so let's go for a middle ground today. We're going to do a bit of protrusion, but not too crazy much. And we're going to make sure this line is crisp so the eye has some structure. deepen up that shadow right here. And this part is typically going to catch some light as it is the tear duct section of the eye. Give our bottom lashes a little bit of space to grow. We're going to apply some of that value shading into our irises where the light is going to catch on the iris. Maybe that part's a little more illuminated. I'm going to erase some of that dark line so I can do a little bit more painting in here. And if that part's getting caught some light, then we're going to have ourselves a specular highlight here. And maybe even a little bit is applied on the inner corners. If you see that inside is a little bit watery, say you just yawned, then yeah, you would definitely see a little bit of light being caught. And so that's like a very generic eye. Usually I will merge them to clean it up. So let's do that. I want to get rid of these really harsh lines, and so I'm going to bust out my soft tool just for a tad bit. Just to fix that transition right there. And so there you got yourselves a super generic eye. Now say you want to know how to draw an eye from various angles. The way I consider it is I try to think about how it will wrap around the face, right? So if I'm drawing it from a 3/4 view, first thing I'm going to do, draw the shape of your head, general shape of your head, an egg shape. 3/4 view, the eye is going to wrap around that egg shape, right? It's going to create this curved line. Find your center line. Your nose is going to fall along your center line. Your mouth is going to fall along your center line. Everything else is measured from that center line, right? And so draw your eyebrows. It's going to be sloping inwards towards that nose. And it's going to 3/4 along your face because you're 3/4 view, correct? And again, your eyes, think about it in clamshells. Drawing your Disney-shaped clamshell. Eyelash. Eyeball right here, so your eye is going to wrap around it. Let me zoom in so you can see a little bit better. Right, you see the clam-shaped shell. And today I'm supposing that they have a monolid, so there's not a lot of indication between their brown bone and their eyeball because there's a lot of fat in that area. And about one eye space away, you're going to have your other eye, and it's going to also fall along this line. And your eyeball is going to get warped because if you're turned, this front part is going to get foreshortened, and so you got to make sure you showcase that. And if your eye is looking this way, you're not going to see any of the whites of the eye because your iris is all the way over here. And then I'm just going to throw in the nose and the mouth. And again, see how they're all following that imaginary line that you draw that curves around. And so that's for 3/4 view. And that's how I would draw it. Now, say if you wanted to draw your eyes in even stranger angles, right? Say you wanted to go from bottom up. Again, we're just going to consider a general egg-shaped head. We're going to now create ourselves a line that wraps around that head. Everything's going to be foreshortened. So your eyebrows are wrapping around your head also. Your nose. And your eyes are going to be right here. And since they're facing this way, honestly, the chances of you actually seeing your eyes quite low. You would probably only see the eyelashes, and so you would only be doing those. Now, how would you draw an eye from a profile view? Well, let's try drawing one from a profile view. So here's how I draw profiles. I draw the general shape of the skull, put in my neck, put in a triangle as the nose, and just a little bit under it is the mouth. And it's going to end just a little bit before that chin that will pop out. Here you got to add your nose bridge. And then you connect it up to the top of your temple. And you can alterate this triangle so it looks more like softer for a female, harsher if it's a male, or for an evil character or a witch or something. And you just play around with changing those basic shapes, right? Until it looks like a head that fits your liking. But for now, let's not be too concerned about the profile of the face. So how would you draw the eye? Well, the eye is going to be sitting right in this eye socket right here, right? Your eye socket's right here, your ear. And so let's draw in an eyebrow to help give you some reference point right over here. And we got to think about that eyeball as a sphere with 2 clamshells wrapping around it. So first one, your eyelid, your top eyelid is open, right? So it's probably gonna be reduced, kind of shrunken like that. Your eyelashes, and again, that sphere is gonna be sitting below that eyelid because it's sunken in and it's wrapped around. So you have to give a little bit of weight into it. Then we're gonna close it off with the bottom eyelid. The cheek's gonna be here. Gotta extend that nose because the nose goes all the way down to the ear. And how do you know how far back to put your eye? Well, that depends on the ethnicity of the character. If you are, say, typically Asian, like Chinese, Eastern Asian, the nose bridge distance is typically much shallower than, say, if you were to do a Caucasian or a Middle Easterner, where their eye socket is much further back. They would have much more deep set eyes. Just like this. Whereas an Asian might have eye sockets that are a lot more shallow like this. And so there's not as much shadow. Here's your hairline. The two contrasts. And so let's talk about some of the most common shapes for eyes that I have seen. Let's hide these. And so here are generally the most basic features of an eye that you can then pick and choose from each characteristic and mix them together to create your very own eye. And so we have our typical round eye, where you're going to see that this width is typically a little bit shorter than, say, an almond eye, and you try to usually create sort of a teardrop shape, sort of like that, to try to mimic a very innocent kind of character. For almond shape, you're going to see it's a lot more elongated this way, sort of like an actual almond. And so variations to this usually either mean you make it thinner, make it fatter, or you can tilt it upwards, downwards, that kind of thing. An upturned eye. The important part of capturing an upturned eye is noticing the ends of the eyes. Upturned eyes, let's draw a line for it, pixel, typically tilts upward, obviously, right? So the inner corner of the eye is going to be lower than the outer corner of the eye. So you can do it subtly like this, or you can do it super crazy, extreme upturned eye, in which you're going to look like a real fox or a cat kind of look, right? It's going to look very much like a cat if you do that. So characters that are more wily or sneaky or cunning, that kind of thing, you might want to consider characterizing them using upturned eyes like a cat. Downturned eyes is the exact opposite. The inner corner of the eye is higher than the lower corner of the eye. And so you're going to get that kind of Bambi doe-eyed look, similar to the girl that we saw in our practice portrait that we did in the last video, where her outer corner of her eye was just so slightly lower, and so she looked like she was bedroom eyes, very sleepy, very innocent, very cute kind of vibe, right? Hooded eyes, the characteristic is that the eyelid space is so tiny, and because it is basically sunken into the eye socket and is being covered up by this layer of fat right here, it's going to cast a darker shadow on the eyelid versus on top of the hooded area, right? Usually you're going to get this dark value that may even extend over into this section, and you're going to get this relatively bright highlight area like that. Now finally, for monolids, the interesting part is this right here is called the epicanthial fold. And when you have a monolid, this will fold over the bottom lid, and so it creates this cast shadow right here. And that's what's going to sell it as a monolid. And typically monolids have a lot more fat in the eyelid region right here. So you're not going to see very dark values, especially in this eye socket region. It's typically going to remain sort of similar, just ever so slightly darker, but very similar in value to the rest of the area, with maybe only the eyelid crease right here being the darker value in that eyelid space. And some really monolided eyes will typically even have this section be in complete shadow because of how monolid it is, right? This part's going to catch a lot of shadow from the eyelash and from the upper lid. This part's going to be super dark because of all that shadow, which is why we get the stereotype of almost looking like it's closed, even though that is not entirely true. Now, how do you change up these types of traits to create your own eye, right? Well, depending on your character personality, you might create an eye that exaggerates the roundness of the round eye, right? To create that sort of very innocent, childlike eye. you make it super huge, super round, super short, right? And right there, it makes the character seem very innocent, naive. Whereas maybe if you wanted a character that is maybe evil or like wicked or cunning or like a seductive witch, right? Then maybe you add more angles to the eyes. So this part right here, instead of our classic really rounded out eye shape, we're gonna add some angles. We're gonna do sort of a diamond parallelogram kind of shape. This part's gonna receive some angles also, right? And we're gonna make sure that iris is gonna be covered up more in order to convey kind of mystery, like I don't even need to have my eyes fully open to deal with you kind of vibe. And for even more angular eye shapes, you might even do it like this, where it creates the illusion of hooded eyes and you don't even see the eyelid anymore because the hood is completely covering up your eyelid space, right? And so you basically look sort of like a droopy, very sleepy kind of vibe. Again, the cat eye. If you do something very high up like this, you have to be prepared that it's not going to look quite human and it's going to look more like a cat, because that is what you essentially are doing when you push the features so far out. Right? And I might even just end it with the classic, my eyes are closed always, because I am a character who is cool and collected until I'm not, until I open up my eyes and bam, I've got like these crazy eye symbols. And you can research different animal type of eyes for these crazy eye symbol things, and that usually typically makes the character seem a lot more inhuman. Say like if I decided to not even do an iris, right? If I just do the slit that you see with snakes and cats, that character is definitely not going to look human. And if you add even more variations, say, maybe I want to do some crazy ruins and stuff, well, now that eye is definitely going to look kind of outerworldly. Right, so that indicates this character is not quite human. Right, so we just talked about the eyes, and now for the mouths, again, we're going to think about that clamshell shape, right? The mouth is sort of going to always look like this, where your teeth are acting similarly. And so you can see right here in the picture, in these various pictures, the mouth wraps around the teeth. Hence, we get these kind of shapes, right? The mouth wraps around the teeth, wraps around, and they all look sort of like round kind of clamshells, right? And so when we're trying to draw mouths from various different angles, first things first, we gotta consider, okay, where is the face? Where's the proportion, right? This is from front view, so the mouth is gonna be relatively straightforward. You have your classic smile. This one is wide open, so they're gonna exaggerate, and so the lip is gonna wrap around the teeth, as in like a big old smile, right? Her teeth, her tongue, big old gape. In this one, you're looking from below, so you're getting this kind of point of view. So everything wraps around the skull like this, and so even the mouth is going to wrap around like that. So in this case, we're going to see that the mouth looks like this. And then the teeth are hiding up here. And then your lips are foreshortened. And then for this one, we're sort of looking at it from this kind of angle. So again, her mouth is going to wrap around it. And so we're going to get her lips wrapping around in this kind of shape. Her teeth wide open. And you end up with this sort of heart shape, right? Now these are just drawings, right? When it comes to actual shading and 3D form, we have to consider something. So let's consider the lip. Let me just draw a regular lip. Now a lip is a 3D form that has roundness. So when you're thinking of shading, you have to think about top-down lighting and where the actual lighting source is. So if the lighting source is here, you're going to get shadows primarily around this region, right? And this region. So you're going to get this really smooth kind of transition, in which I will demonstrate right here. Oops. Push this down to the bottom layer. Suppose this is your lip color and this basic background is your skin color, right? In order for the lip to read as a lip, we gotta follow these curves that we see here. So if the lighting is from top down, we're gonna see that this bottom part's gonna catch more shadow. Especially these areas where your lip is sort of conversing upwards, pushing upwards, and doesn't have as much exposure to the light source. That's why it's going to be a little darker. And you're going to end up with these little corners that are really dark, and you get that kind of stylistic choice. Same thing goes for the bottom part of the lip. We gotta cover this part in shadow. Treat it as it's similar to your skin because your lip is not separate from your face. It's part of it. So it's gonna be rounded out like this. You're gonna have a shadow right here, oftentimes mixed in like this. And occasionally your skin will have the same value as your lip. Right? And that's how you consider painting a lip, right? A really generic basic lip. And a little bit of shadow is going to be cast on top of that bottom lip. We distinguish this by creating a darker value in between to separate them and indicate that these are two separate entities, right? And then you have your lip right here. A very generic kind of female looking lip. For males, they typically don't have as thick of an upper lip. And so if we do this, say, let's copy this, duplicate layer. Say I shrink that upper lip. Right? I'm gonna shrink that upper lip. We're gonna make it into a male kind of lip. And so even if the bottom lip is sort of full, as long as the upper lip is somewhat thinner, it'll still read sort of like a male lip. So if it's thinner, that means it's probably not going to be seeing as much light source. And so it's going to be in darker shadow like this. right? And you can see how it's reading like a male lip versus the one on the right, reading more like a female lip because it's receiving a lot more of that plumpness on the top. And you can practice drawing mouths in different angles by trying to simplify the form, right? From the side, you're gonna see that, here, let's draw a mouth from the side. It's that old clam shape, right? We got our upper lip, our bottom lip, and it's closed out like this. And here you can see it's plump. So when you shade it, you have to consider where's your light source, right? It's gonna act like this because it doesn't get that much light, because if it's coming from the top, your lip is being shaded, and you're gonna also cast a slight shadow down here. Whereas this bottom part is gonna receive a lot more of that light. Then you'd have your basic shadows that would cast on top of your Cupid's bow. Cupid's bow. You can see here the Cupid's bow creates this sort of haven of light on top of the lip, ever so slightly. Always very subtle kind of value changes. We're not going too crazy or else it's going to look really fake. Here you can see the shadow of the nose doesn't quite cover the mouth or the Cupid's bow because the light source is coming this way, and so this top part's gonna get lit a little bit. So let's just move this down. And so let's start talking about the nose. So on to the nose. Now we know that the nose has that typical shape, right? It has a nose bridge right here, has the sides of the nose and the nostrils. Well, when we're painting or drawing noses, we can consider it in a relatively simple shape as a triangle. We're going to have the tip of the nose, the side of the nose, the nostril, and then you just connect that to your brow bone, right? And then you erase away these areas because you're not going to actually draw those parts typically. So when we're painting a nose, we also have to think about it in those general shapes. And so we have to think about where the light source is again. So let's say light source is coming from this way. So this side of the nose is going to receive the light area. This side of the nose is going to receive the light area, whereas this side of the nose is going to receive the shadowy area, right? And then everything else is just transitioning in between those two values. So the top part here is probably not going to be as dark. We're going to have some shadow here just because it is casting, your nose is underneath, right? So it's going to cast a shadow this way. And you're going to end up with somewhat of a shadow like in this sort of sense. And the way you shade these major planes right here is how you're going to create shape of the nose, right? So in this particular guy, his nose is relatively pointed downwards. You can see his nostrils point sort of inwards like this. And so the major shadow is going to be this part, and then this part's going to be lit up because the light is bouncing back up this way. But this part is still the brightest, and there's just a tiny bit of shadow here to indicate that the nose recedes inwards. Just like that. And so if we were to paint his nose, let's try doing that. So draw our triangle, paint our triangle. It's much easier to paint noses like this. Paint our triangle, do a little triangle. Triangle with a tiny diamond shape at the end, so sort of like an upside down kite. Right, and then we're going to establish our light side. So this half of the nose is in the bright side. And we can simplify the form of the nose using bigger shapes and identifying these big shapes. So this part's going to look sort of like a half diamond, right? And we're going to add in our nostrils right now, so we're able to determine how the form of the nose is supposed to be. So we're going to carve out those edges of the nostril. Try to make it as clean as you can. And select a slightly darker value, as this part is where like the hole is, so it's going to cast a shadow down there. And some of this light bounced underneath that nose, hence why we're doing this part. And if you squint your eyes, you can tell that we're trying to capture this major light area, right? Even if there's a slight shadow, if you squint your eyes, you should still be able to see generally the dark shapes. If you can't see them, that means your values aren't distinct enough. And so we're going to try to make sure we got distinct enough values, especially on the edge of the nose. And we're just going to extend that canvas so it doesn't look so out of nowhere, right? Then his beard is right here. He has like a super dark beard. And as a result, right here underneath the nose, it caught some of that shadow. And so it helps distinguish that edge between the nose and the face. Gotta clean up this edge right here. And make it darker so it actually looks distinct enough. And so you have this general shape of a nose right here, right? Now, say you want to paint a very simplified, sort of cartoonish kind of nose. Typically, the way I paint it, I draw out the nostrils first. Let's give it a face so it's not sitting out there alone. Center line, erase it now that you've got the general. Suppose this person has a smirk or something. Make sure their chin isn't being swallowed up or anything. Alright, and so the nose was right here, right? So how would you paint that? Establish your basic core shadows, right? Core shadow. We're supposing that the light source is going to be coming from this way. So the nose is going to cast a shadow on that face. And now we're going to darken up the values so the nose actually feels like it's popping out of your face. Might even darken up this shadow just a tad bit. So your eye sockets look like this. We don't know, maybe your eyes are closed. And then you might even, you just add like a tiny little speckle to indicate the roundness of the nose, which might be more apparent if you have like a, say, a button nose, whereas if you have more of a flatter, smoother nose, then maybe that specular highlight might not be as strong, right? And so that's a nose right there. Now let's see some other examples of noses in different angles, right? So let me shrink this baby down a little bit. And so what really changes up the nose shape really depends on the bridge of the nose, the tip of the nose, and the angle of the nostrils. So you see some variations here include, so some variations that are seen here is this hooked bridge right here. And because it's hooked, that shadow becomes this sort of hooked kind of shadow. Becomes this irregular shape that if you typically had a smooth nose, maybe that shadow would just be like this. Another example of a hooked nose, or a nose that kind of faces downward instead of upwards. Her nose right here sits basically perpendicular to the floor, right? And so her shadows that are going to be cast are just going to be straight down. It's not going to be looking like this, a softer transition of a shadow. It's going to be a very dark shadow. And you probably won't even see the holes of the nostril, right? In this one, you might be able to see a little bit of the nostrils, but this one, it's basically facing downwards, so you basically won't see any of it. I included this picture here to show you how you would approach drawing the nose from various different angles, correct? So again, let's break down the nose into its most basic form, which is a triangle. So if it's from front view, your triangle will look like this, like a Muppet, right? Like Bert and Ernie or Squidward, whatever fits your fancy. From the side profile, it's going to be a stuck out triangle, and you can vary how tilted or how much of an isosceles, how much of a right angle triangle you want it to be to make your nose. If you're drawing it from more complex angles, you're going to also want to go back to the idea of how does the nose wrap around the face. Draw on your guidelines. So the nose is going to wrap around like this. So you're going to see the nose bridge right on top. It's going to stick out just a little bit like that, and you can simplify it typically by just drawing the nostril part and the tip of the nose to capture that kind of angle. And that will usually read as a nose from top down angle, right? I didn't have to draw this second half of the nostril. And then when you shade, obviously you would shade like this, and you wouldn't allow us to see the nostrils because the nostrils are facing down, regardless of how upturned your nose are, because you're looking downwards. If you're looking upwards, same concept, draw your guidelines, center line, your eye line wraps around your head, mouth wraps around your head, your nose also wraps around your head, so you're going to get a rounded out triangle that sticks up forward like this, and you're going to see full on those peepers right here. So everyone's going to look sort of like Mr. Piggy from that angle, regardless of how much you may not like Mr. Pig from the Muppets or something like that, or Miss Piglet. It's going to happen from here. But obviously different nostril shapes might change the profile of this nose. And so that should cover quite a bit of the different ways you can approach drawing a nose. Obviously, when you're mixing and matching, trying to draw different types of nose, maybe you might want more of a button nose where your nostrils are going to be super exposed, and in which case that means your character is going to look more spry like an elf, right? Or even look more naive, more childish, because children's noses tend to be more button-like. Or you could even potentially draw a character with a very stout nose, very strong brow, very straight to the floor kind of nose. Then you get a very kind of strong character looking archetype. Regardless of how you mix and match the nose bridges and the direction of the nostrils, just remember the nose is a triangle. So when you're trying to paint it, shade it, render it using black values or color, try to break it down into your core shadow, your light area, and then the small nuances is where the nose sort of takes shape, right? You're going to try to capture that little tip of the nose, but you're not going to try to push it too hard, because if you push it too hard, you're going to end up with a very fake looking kind of over contoured nose. And so the next feature we want to focus on are the ears. Ears may not seem very important, but you would be surprised to think that if you're not able to properly render an ear, the head tends to look a little bit lacking, right? Say I drew a head and I just meh the ears. You're obviously going to look a lot more cartoony than if you put in just a little bit more effort to, say, do a couple more details to your ears. Say you add in that darkness like that, and your ear looks just oh so slightly more realistic, right? And it's only just a little bit of change. And so the most important part of an ear comes from capturing this edge and this whole shape. If you're able to capture it, see how I can draw an ear relatively quickly. Right, you got yourself an ear, and you didn't even have to work that hard. You can even simplify it even further. and it'll still look somewhat like an ear. Albeit it'll be a little more cartoony, but from far away it will look like an ear. And so how do we add value to an ear? Because it's not just black and white, obviously, right? An ear has value. So let's draw ourselves an ear, and then I will show you the major parts to think about when you're painting an ear. So you're going to want to capture that little earlobe part, the tragus I think it's called. The part where the earring looks really pretty, but I can imagine it kind of hurts to get pierced. Alright, so we have our basic ear, right? So when we're painting it, again, the ear is a 3D form. So this part does have form, right? It does have weight, it has volume. Get your major shadows down. This particular section especially, where your ear kind of folds into itself, and so there's going to be a crazy amount of shadow there. This part typically captures some of that shadow depending on whether you have the light source on top, behind, or in front. Typically this part is going to get a little shadow. This part's definitely going to get shadow because you can see how the ear covers that part, so you gotta follow it. This part of the ear pops out, so we gotta showcase that. Because it pops out, it's going to cast a slight shadow there. This part, depending on the person, may stick out more or less, but typically it will have sort of a slight bump, and this part that rounds and comes into it, it's going to get sort of a rounded sphere kind of shadow. And there you have a generally very rough shading of an ear. And so I included some other pictures of an ear from like a not so common angle, and I thought it might be interesting on how I would approach drawing that. And so an ear is basically sort of like a half oval, right? Like a Mr. Potato Head kind of shape. And so even from behind, the ear is going to look sort of like an oval or like a stick-on Gundam piece, like that. But it just has some slight folds and variations in order to make it look like an ear. And so if I'm drawing this from the back, I like to draw in the head first, so I have a good foundation, or else where am I putting that ear on? Your face, your chest? That would be a pretty weird place to put your ear. So here's your head, here's your neck. So the ear is going to sit right here. Right, like a Mr. Potato Head. It's gotta pop out, so I gotta make sure that head is shook back in. Stuff that back in there. And this part is the part, if you feel your ear, that's where it caves in, so you have to get that fold, right? And then you can just get that slight fold captured here, because your ear becomes basically sort of like a megaphone, like this, where you draw it like that, but then you just cut it off straight here where your head is. Similar shape, right? And some things to consider when you're drawing ears on a character are whether the ears are popping more forward or are they sitting closer to the head. So some characters may have their ear pretty wide out like this, and that will inevitably make them look more like a monkey or a very playful character, like this. Or a character's ear might be a lot closer to their head, in which case you're really not going to see any of the features that I talked about here. Right, see, I'm only doing two big old shadows, but it still looks like an ear. And if it's closer to the head, what you're basically only going to see is like the top skin part and then a little bit of this conch part sticking out. And some variations on ear shapes. You have that classic separated lobe like this. Some people's lobes aren't separated at all and it just connects directly into it. My earlobe personally looks more like that rather than say it's connected and it doesn't have this part. But obviously there are a lot of variations in the world, and so I can't discount that maybe you want to explore those options. And I mean, they look kind of cool too. And then obviously you can change the shape of the tip of the ear right here, right? If you make it pointy, it's gonna look like a demon, devil, or an elf. And the only difference you would make when you're doing that is you just extend this whole section upwards. Same idea. You got a shadow right here, shadow right here. Still that same old shape, you just make it pointy, right? And then you would just add jewelry if you want. Some typical earring jewelry that I have seen are the tragus, these types of hoops, regular earrings. Some are banana and they will do this. I have never done that. I can imagine it hurts, but it does look cool. Some people do it inside the conch area, right? And last but not least is hair. And so hair is such an important part for defining a character that I just want to give you some tips on how to approach painting hair, since we all might want to fall into that trap of painting hair individual strand by strand, but that's just going to take way too long of a time, and I'm sure that everyone would like to finish painting the hair and go get a cup of ice cream or something, right? So let me show you some examples of some hair. So when we want to talk about hair, we have to think about it in big shapes, right? Let me pull up some examples of some varieties of hair. We have a variety of straight hair, natural hair, and sort of short hair kind of thing. So let me show you an example of how you would say draw, render straight hair. So let me bust out this kind of girl with the long hair maybe. Okay, say her hair is kind of like that. All right, let's give it first a base color. I'm choosing this sort of darker color because that will make it easier for me to show you how the shadows and the highlights will really pop. If I chose like a light color, maybe it'd be kind of difficult for you to see. And I like dark haired gals, as I am also a dark haired gal, so. I typically keep the ends of my hair relatively light, as I like this kind of wispy kind of vibe. And it also makes it look sort of more dreamy rather than like super harsh, say like Sailor Moon or anime kind of hair, like that. Anyway, here's your base color, right? Now we're just gonna go in with our shadow. So we're gonna choose a value that's darker. Zoom, zoom. All right, so our light source, where is it, right? Let's pretend it's here. So that means anything that is below that is gonna cast a shadow. As it gets farther away from that light source, it's gonna have a shadow, especially here. That ear is gonna cast a shadow on that hair. The bangs that are tucked in are gonna get some shadow, especially where your hair is sort of like tucked behind your ear. There's gonna create this kind of fold. Especially if you're closer to the neck and face where your hair is basically blanketing you and you're not gonna see much light. This part's probably gonna be super dark in value. Almost pitch black. Same for here. Same for right here where it's rounding into the hair and the ear. And since the hair isn't a flat piece of mess and we want to make sure we do have some volume for a girl, we gotta stick it out a bit, you know? And if it's sticking out, there's probably gonna be a shadow right here, right? And then the skin, the hairline is gonna come up right into there. And this part, maybe it'll cast just a tiny bit of shadow because it is sitting away from that light. And maybe we'll break up some of that chunks in the bottom part by indicating which parts are in front, which parts in the back, right? So we got our general basic hair values, right? We can even darken it a little more, make it even more contrasty if the light source is like crazy strong. But this is the general idea. And so now we're going to come in with our highlight. And so we don't want to make it white because that's going to be crazy too harsh. So we're going to choose a color that's, say, about here, a little lighter, so it reads as a highlight. And we're going to do big old generic blobs, right? And then we're going to cut into them, break up their shape to simulate sort of hair. So we're going to do shapes like this, or like this, or like this. In general, you're making this kind of bow tie shape kind of thing. And the key is not to have it too close to the edge of the hair or else it's going to look really flat. And so since this light source is coming here, it's going to catch the top of the head really strongly, just like that. Maybe some of that highlight gets caught down here, not as bright, but it still gets caught. And then we'll finally lighten it up with the high contrast because this light source is crazy strong. With just a little bit of that bright highlight near the center of that regular highlight, right? And don't go too crazy with it or else it's going to look really fake, very plasticky. And there you have your generic hair. Now let's say you want to try painting natural hair like in this girl's picture right here. Looks really hard. You might think, oh, maybe I need to do all her little curls like this, right? Well, that's just going to take you till the end of time, till global warming finally ends us all, right? So let's not do that. I'm going to merge these two layers. Hide that away for a second. So what we're going to do is we're thinking in big shapes. Let's first get down her base hair shape. And right now I'm just squinting my eyes, trying to consider, okay, what's that shape of that hair, right? Looks sort of like a flower, sort of like a cloud. Not worrying too much about capturing all those tiny little curls. Okay, that looks about right. Now what you do, get the shadow values down, lock the layer, and we're gonna come in with those shadow layers. Since even if this hair is really curly and it doesn't sit on the head just like regular straight hair would, it still has volume, right? And so that means this top part of the hair is gonna catch the light, whereas this bottom part of the hair is gonna be all sitting in shadow. And you're gonna wanna vary your brush strokes so it's gonna look like it's actually acting as hair and not just, say, a helmet. Then we're going to bust out our number 93 brush, which has this really nice texture like this to help create some of that curliness that we see in the hair. And be careful not to go too crazy with it, or else the viewer's eye may get overwhelmed by all the texture. So I would just choose a couple of spots to put it in. Maybe even use it to capture some of that hair on the outside. And you may think that this area, there's like some shadowy parts right here. Don't worry too much about it, because when you're doing hair, you're supposed to concern yourself mostly with like big shapes, because if we get too much into the details, it's going to start looking very cluttered. And so the final steps we're going to do here is we're going to take this 391 brush, which is called the sampled brush, and it basically has these little varied speckles like this, to try to add some of that light that's in her hair, right? And don't go too crazy with it. Again, just the smallest amount, right? Even come in with this 150 brush, which looks something like that, to add even further interest in the hair. Lock the layers, because I am trying to capture that sort of lightness that hinges on the edge of her hair. There you go, you got natural looking hair, right? And you didn't even have to work that hard. Now, one more way of thinking about hair, especially for short hair, because it's so close to the head, it can get kind of confusing. So I'll just show you real quick how to paint shorter hair. Again, you're just going to think about it in big shapes, right? Spiky hair. So I imagine this guy asked for a dope ass fade, and then told the barber, you can do whatever you want with the top part of my hair. So I imagine that this hair is short, but still long enough that you're gonna get some kind of 3D form, where you're gonna catch the light enough that you're gonna cast a shadow just like this, right? Break it up a little bit. And so I didn't do too much crazy work with this, but it still looks like short, spiky hair, right? And so ultimately, hair, think in big shapes. If you can, squint your eyes, just like how I taught you to paint portraits. Squint your eyes, see the big values, the shapes. And if you're able to do that, I think it'll be really helpful for you to paint basically anything. And you can paint any hairstyle. You can even go crazy with the character design and everything. So that's it for this video, and I will see you next time when we talk about the difference between male and female features.